Okay, I think we'll start. Welcome to this seminar on democracy promotion in a state of geopolitical tension, or how the EU can promote democracy in a state of geopolitical tensions. My name is Pernille Rieker. I'm a research professor here at NUPI, head of our Center for European Studies. And this seminar, first of all, I will say that this seminar will be streamed, so that's good to know. But this seminar is part of NUPI's seminar series on Europe, and it is thematically related also to a new project that we have started, which is funded by the European Commission, Horizon Europe project, with the title Re-engage. So we are looking at how the EU can re-engage with the countries on the Western Balkans, but also in Eastern Europe. Following the 2022 Russian aggression or Russian invasion of Ukraine, enlargement have, of course, become on the top of the EU's agenda once again. And after decades of stalemate, enlargement has become now again a key security instrument. And the EU has started negotiations with both Ukraine and Moldova, but also with Bosnia and Herzegovina, committing itself to a European future for the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe. Still, in a state of increased geopolitical tensions, the enlargement process is being challenged, not only by disagreements internally in the EU on how to proceed, but also by external actors, such as Russia, who do not want to see these countries in the EU. So this makes it even more important for the EU to make enlargement into a success, because it's really about security. It has always been about security, but now it has become even more urgent. But of course, preparing for membership is not an easy task. It is a very cumbersome process that covers adjustments in many different policy areas, and also alignment with a large number of EU rules, the EU acquis. But still, the most important and perhaps also the most challenging task is probably to find a way to assist these countries in building resilient democratic societies that have a high level of trust, horizontal trust as well as vertical trust, and with well-functioning institutions and good governance structures. So in other words, well-functioning democratic systems that may resist various attempts at democratic backsliding from internal and external forces or pressure. So the key question is, how can this be achieved? What are the lessons learned from the enlargement process so far? In other words, what should the EU do differently to promote democracy in candidate countries? And today we are very fortunate to have with us Nedim Hodzic, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oslo, also from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you have also been a consultant for many international institutions. And with no further ado, I will just give the floor to you. We very much look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Pernille. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk here at NUPI, because I remember NUPI, and when I first encountered it, it was actually in Bosnia. It was a provider of expertise for the reform of the security sector and parliamentary oversight over intelligence affairs. And NUPI at the time did a very good job. It was due to backsliding that has occurred later as a result of inefficient enlargement process that we have lost some of the standards that NUPI helped us build back in the first decade of this century. This talk is dedicated primarily to how can the EU promote democracy in a state of geopolitical tensions. And therefore, it's mostly a criticism of what the EU hasn't done or should have done or could have done. Obviously, I could have given a talk on what any of the Western Balkan states is, the problems that it has, but that's something that I will reflect upon in my talk. So if you feel for a moment that I'm putting too much criticism on the EU and not some other actors or not local actors, that's not because I think very highly of them. That's because we want to focus today on what can the EU do and what it should have done. And the EU never really thought that it would be easy. The EU thought it would be an experiment. Olli Rehn, today I believe the governor of Central Bank of Finland and the former enlargement commissioner, used to say back in 2005, 2006, if you look up his speeches, that it's a laboratory. The Western Balkans is a laboratory, and in this laboratory, we do experiment with many approaches because we're dealing with post-conflict societies. We're not just dealing with states that want to join the EU, so we're building peace, but we're also promoting economic development, we're promoting free market, we're promoting rule of law, we're promoting everything of the so-called Copenhagen criteria that are the basis for enlargement. Since nobody really knew how the Copenhagen criteria materialized, the EU kind of learned through its mistakes and then hoped to correct all of them or in the enlargement to the Western Balkans. And this didn't really happen, because the result that we see now is that the experiment went like a bowl that you use for building cultures of bacteria in laboratories. Okay, maybe not the best comparison I could have used, but still, the experiment didn't really yield the results. It didn't create new member states. It created strange, opaque societies and states which are in a relationship with the EU that's not easy to describe. And therefore I will use many simplifications in order to explain how did we get here. And I will start with a starting point that people, and I used this sort of almost biblical kind of metaphor, the 7 sins of enlargement. Maybe I should have said the 7 paradoxes of enlargement. But maybe if you think about this conception as a sort of dichotomy between virtues and sins, maybe some of my messages will get easier across and be better understood. So economic development, if anything, that should have been a virtue of an ever-closing relationship of the Western Balkan states with the EU. It didn't really happen. What happened is that the states in the Balkans, despite having some sort of free trade arrangement, some sort of stabilization and association agreements with the EU, stand at the 40% of the EU's average GDP. Mind you, in 2008 or 2009, in most of these countries, the salaries and the incomes were higher on a per capita level, despite what was at the time widespread tax evasion. Despite that, they stood higher than that of Bulgaria and Romania. In fact, it's a known fact that even at the beginning of the century in Serbia, a country that was ravaged by sanctions, by war, by dictatorial regime of Slobodan Milosevic, they had some foreign workers from Romania coming over because there were more opportunities in early 21st century Serbia than in early 21st century Bulgaria and Romania. And that tells you that the pace of economic development has been slow, and it has been slow because the countries weren't really good in attracting foreign investment. But also it has been slow because the EU didn't, for example, recognize opportunities to invest in green transition. In fact, the EU passed legislation that would prevent its own companies by engaging in projects that had to deal with coal. As a result of this, Serbia, Bosnia, and even Montenegro looked for opportunities to modernize their power plants, which were heavily polluting the environment, through finances from China, from opaque sources and from sources that weren't really, not just transparent, but of which we weren't really sure that they would bring the necessary change. But the more important aspect is that if you compare the countries of the Western Balkans with those that joined the EU in 2004. And if you compare the processes that have happened so far, right, because the enlargement process is not something that starts when the country is given candidacy status. You know, if you would think of candidacy status, you would say, well, I don't know, the EU has been engaging Bosnia since 2022, but that's not really true. In fact, the enlargement process for any of these countries started way much more earlier. And as a part of these, and as opposed to the processes where everything, everywhere, all at once, as the famous movie goes, happened in 2004. Here, you had foreign investment, but in banking and in financial services. All the banks, pretty much all the banks in the Western Balkans are foreign-owned. Many companies are foreign-owned. Many greenfield foreign investments have happened in Serbia, but also elsewhere. But it was never this immediacy where the process of foreign investment happens quickly, where full mobility of labor force is achieved for the people from these countries, where access to structural and cohesion funds, which are critical to rebuilding and remodeling the infrastructure, happens. Rather, what happened was the opening of the markets, a gradual liberalization of the workforce mobility, meaning from the Balkans to the EU, but only in some key critical sectors. So not full mobility, but for all nurses, for all doctors, for all IT engineers, for all engineers, for all operators of machinery, which has left some parts of, for example, northern Albania without medical staff to operate the hospitals. In some parts of Bosnia, this has also now become a problem. It happens also in other 4 jurisdictions, but in these two are, you could say, heavily hit when you look at the per capita statistics of number of doctors per the service. Because people are going away, and people are going away mostly on Germany, mostly to Germany, which tells you that, it's not like how many politicians from the EU, especially from the Netherlands, think, well, we are giving away free money and we don't get nothing in return. No, you get cheap labor force in return. And then in many jurisdictions, what happens is that these people are issued fake diplomas for fake medical, not degrees of doctors, though, for nursery and things. And then this gets discovered, but not really pressed, even when it's discovered especially in Germany and in some Nordic countries, because they don't want to pressure that. They could resolve this issue if they wanted, but such is the need for the medical staff that they don't really pursue this matter as much as they could. The local actors, in fact, do conduct investigations, and prosecutions have been made, especially in Montenegro and in Bosnia, regarding this. So there is an asymmetry in the economic sense, which needs to be addressed and talked about as a starting point. And the other thing where the EU has invested a lot, as opposed to economic development, if you can compare the two, is the area of the rule of law. New court buildings, separation of court buildings from the prosecutorial offices, super advanced, expensive trainings for people who would conduct financial investigations, money laundering allegations, sharing of data with Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia, primarily with regards to prosecutions of transnational amazing networks smuggling narcotics. So it's not like there's no result in the field of rule of law. It's the problem is that it's an image of a goal here, because they keep moving the goalpost. It's never enough. Whatever you do for the rule of law in the Western Balkans, no matter how much they invest, no matter what the local actors do, it's never enough. It's always a problem. And that's because they frame the rule of law not as, this relationship where you have legal certainty, predictability, legal system that supports economic development, citizens who have great trust in courts. These are all, I think we would agree, very important values. Rather, the framing that we see, and it's never really expressed anywhere. This is something that I have sort of tried to construct in need of establishing some sort of a presumption on which they operate. And when I say they, I mean the legal experts that the European Commission and the local delegations facilitate, seems to be that the key to the rule of law is judicial independence. Now, I'm all for judicial independence. It's an extremely important value. But how do you measure it? How do you think about it? In 2004, what they thought was, well, we will have a judicial self-governance body, usually called Judicial Council, Prosecutorial Council, in which many judges or prosecutors will sit, because they will have their own elections, have people who will sit in these councils, decide on judicial budget, decide on appointments, decide on many important things. And this has happened. And we have that in all of these countries. the part that the EU seems to be interested most in is whether the judiciary goes after top corrupt officials. Now think about it. Judiciary does many things, many important things. If you think about the rule of law only as judicial independence, and if you interpret judicial independence only through whether the judiciary goes after top corrupt officials, that's a very limited benchmark to operate with. If you exclude all the other variables and think only just about that, that's a very limited benchmark to operate with. And secondly, it's not like these things don't happen. Think about of the EU member states. Think about Romania, which had an amazing judicial anti-corruption campaign led by the person that is today the European Public Prosecutor Office head, Laura Codruta Kövesi, and they don't necessarily, but the country hasn't necessarily really defeated corruption. It has established a certain level of accountability. It has ended impunity, and that's because you cannot really end corruption by definition. It just keeps you have to fight it all the time, and all the time you have to mobilize resources. In Northern Macedonia and in Bosnia, where you had actually prosecutions of top-level officials, that didn't do much in the perception of these countries amongst the EU officials. It didn't do much in them becoming recognized as a country that is closer to the EU. For example, they value more the fact that Serbia has changed certain constitutional provisions regulating the independence of the judiciary than these top-level prosecutions, despite the fact that in their country reports that the EU prepares, of which I will talk later, for all of these countries, they try to measure every single prosecution that happens. These inconsistent standards lead to high expectations that the people have of the judiciary. Nowhere except in Balkans will you see, and I did my PhD on judicial anti-corruption campaigns, so I've been to Romania, Italy, and Brazil trying to study them, but nowhere in the Balkans will you see this image and this demand, especially I would say in Bosnia and Serbia, that people, that the fair prosecutors and judges can save the nation, can really establish accountability. Now, that's a wonderful notion because it tells you that people have a true demand for justice, that people want justice, that people don't want street justice, summary executions, that people want the rule of law, that people want prosecutors who will stand up to organized crime and political corruption. But we know that it's not realistic that the countries will be, defended by judges and judges alone and prosecutors alone. Much more is needed. Democratic consolidation is what's needed. Democratic consolidation is what everybody expected, and it's not that it hasn't happened. Recently, we have seen the elections in Northern Macedonia. We have seen that and the ruling Social Democrats lost, and they lost in a landslide. And we see the populist nationalists getting back to power. We will see how will they compose the government, but they have came back to power. Now, we see peaceful transitions of government. We see free and fair elections. We have seen in Montenegro the defeat of Milo Đukanović, who was ruling the country for such a long time. But we haven't seen, for example, an approach in which the EU critically impacts the elections in Bosnia. We have not seen that. And they had legal grounds to do it, because the legal system in Bosnia and Herzegovina is still, and when I say legal, I mean the electoral system, is still based on its constitution that we know runs against the European Convention on Human Rights, and we know this not just because legal experts say so, but because the European Court of Human Rights has said so in numerous judgments. What could have the EU done? Well, they could have just said, we don't want to accept the results of these elections until you change and amend the constitution to be in greater conformity to the rule of law and to human rights provisions. So as you can see in my talk, it's not just about the EU not doing too much and being too tough on us. It's also about the EU sometimes being very lenient towards us, meaning Western Balkan countries. So instead, the EU decided, and that would have solved many other issues, because the electoral system in Bosnia is also very fragmented. In fact, it's so fragmented and so proportional that it fosters corruption by its very definition. I won't go into this now because it would take us too far. In Serbia also, I mean, you have an electoral system in which the entire country is an electoral unit. You don't have proper electoral districts. The capital, Belgrade, while undoubtedly being still a center of that country and the region itself, is overly represented. And there is no true connection in Serbia between the MPs, members of the parliament, and those sitting in and the citizens. And nobody addresses this, you know. They go and they measure whether Serbia had 104 or 106 cases of corruption. Yes, yet these issues, which run to the very core of the democracy in these two countries, have not been addressed. Whereas in Northern Macedonia, for example, when it was discovered that the populist nationalists who got back to power now were 10 or 12 years ago wiretapping and listening to the basically entire country, there was a whole system devised by the EU with some help from others in order to foster a gradual democratization of the government. And that, for what it's worth, that was quite a successful episode. It's over now, but it was a successful episode. And it's difficult to see why it was justified to engage in Northern Macedonia back then. And now, with all this interest about enlargement, electoral systems of Bosnia and Serbia are not of interest, although we know they generate corruption and undemocratic solutions and responses. Equal opportunities, by this I meant equal opportunities really for the countries, for the 6 countries. Historically, it wasn't 6, it was 7 countries, because Croatia used to be also a part of the Western Balkans before it joined the EU in 2013, because that's how Western Balkans ends. You join the EU and you're no longer Western Balkans, which also tells you something about the framing, but let's not go into post-colonial narratives at this point. So anyway, equal opportunities would mean, well, that each country is judged on merits, basically on what it has done, what it hasn't done, that, you know, there will be a sort of system of monitoring. Of course, it is true, nobody expected back then that the whole process would last for 20 years, that, you know, the declaration would be made in Thessaloniki by European leaders that there is a European future for the Western Balkans, and then the European future wouldn't really materialize in enlargement. But there was this notion that, of course, each country would be measured in an equal way. But significant bias exists. A think tank based in Serbia, I believe, called Center for European Policy or European Policy Studies, actually looked at the biases present in country reports for each of the 6 countries. And they discovered that the countries are measured in these institutional, governmental sense, in different ways. That, for example, in one country, they look actually at the parliaments. They look at whether there's parliamentary oversight, whether the executive is being overseen by the MPs, but in others they don't. If you look at the report for Bosnia, it says, without any context, just in the middle, there is a sentence, financial literacy remains low. I looked at the 5 other reports expecting to see, well, where do we rank on financial literacy? Why does it matter? What is it? We learn nothing about financial literacy in 5 other. It's low in Bosnia, but we don't know about it. Then I, of course, as a you know, I did what scholars do. I started Googling on Google Scholar to see what other people say, what the libraries say. And you realize there is a number, actually, of very good research papers in each of these countries on financial literacy. And they say that it's low, but they evidence that the scientific community, some of the banks, and some foreign donors have invested in making financial literacy higher in each one of these countries. What do country reports tell us about this? Nothing. They just tell us that financial literacy in Bosnia is low. Then I started to try to compare on my own, how does financial literacy in Bosnia rank to other countries. Basically, it's all the same. You cannot really distinguish one from the other. So it tells you that there's a lot of sloppy monitoring, sloppy reporting. It's not based on merits. And the reason why is because it's not really transparent and we don't really know how reports are being produced. In some country reports that they produce, you will find a footnote that says there has been a degree of consultation with NGOs, with the international community present in the country, and that's true. It's not like there's one person writing the entire desk officer of the European Commission, which works for some of these countries. It's not like they write these reports by themselves. It wouldn't be doable. But it also tells you that they are not very transparent. And yet, whenever a country report is published each year, the media, critical of the government and critical of the absence of enlargement, says, you see, there is a report, and this report tells us that you haven't really done your homework. Always this, not patrimonial, always this sort of rhetoric of not doing the homework, you know, like as if you're a kid in a school, you're not doing your homework. Wherein in reality, you don't know how the reports are produced, which doesn't mean, so I'm not implying that these countries are wonderful, that these countries do not have all the problems that the reports point out to, but rather that the reporting is sloppy, it's inefficient. It doesn't give weight to the fact that, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina prosecuted the head of its intelligence agency, that it prosecuted the head of the executive government in one part of the country for COVID-related, for COVID procurement-related crimes. We know that COVID procurement crimes have happened across the world. Bosnia is one of the few countries that actually prosecuted someone. If the country reports are true, and if the situation in Bosnia is so bad regarding rule of law, these prosecutions wouldn't have happened in the first place. No investigations wouldn't have happened, let alone prosecutions, let alone a final judgment prosecuting these people for these crimes. So I don't think that the EU itself should trust its own reporting. And especially because the reporting doesn't reveal the fact that, you know, the reason why financial literacy is presented is not necessarily because somebody left it, because they were tired of editing a 170-page document full of non sequiturs, but rather because when you have that sentence there, you can use it to mobilize funds and to say there is a demonstrated need for financial literacy, and therefore there is reason for the EU to commit 600,000 euros for this. Who will get these funds? Well, not necessarily the local actors. There is a perception that whatever money is being invested or given or provided to the Western Balkans, that it somehow just goes directly to the budget or goes to the NGOs or goes to the various units of government. That is not so. In fact, most money goes to so-called technical assistant projects that often use domestic staff, but are actually owned and operated by European-based companies, meaning that most of this money goes back through tax back to the EU. So, but you cannot explain, for example, there's a competition now in Bosnia over which of the developmental banks present will fund a certain section of a reconstruction of a very dangerous mountain road between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Montenegro. To whom would you explain? To whom would you tell that, you know, you have 2 or 3 developmental banks that are fighting each other for which one will fund this, because the local directors of these banks want to look good to their bosses in London or Washington. And of course, if you're a local politician, it's not like you can say, well, you know, we cannot really fund the road in the next 3 years because the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development told us that they're investing too much in the public sector, so when we pay off part of our debt in 3 years, they will give us the money, notwithstanding the fact that we are that we have the creditability, that we can fund the project if we take the money from them. So there is a lot of these, you know, technical issues that just get lost. and that people who are in the know, people who have worked on this, and the reason why I know of this is not because I'm a academic researcher with a very good university, is because I was involved in some of these and then you get to know that the sort of dynamics on the ground shapes things and delays projects, and creates a lot of demand for time. Now, another structural project, which problem, which is completely different from this, which happens at the ground level. This one happens, at the sort of macro level. Usually, and especially to Bosnia, when they want to say what should be done, they say, well, Bosnia should speak to Europe with one voice, which reflects the fragmentation existing in the country as a result of its political divisions. But the opposite could be said now. Bosnia would be happy if Europe would be able to speak with one voice to Bosnia, because quite simply European unity, which was something that, despite the failure of the project of the European Constitution, was not really in doubt, quite simply does not really exist when it comes to the Western Balkans and dealing with the Western Balkans. And we have instead, I wouldn't say that each member state has its own policy towards Europeanization, but definitely each state is perfectly capable, its political class, it's perfectly capable of weaponizing this for its own purposes. And we have seen this in France and the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, quite simply as a part of this sort of notion that exists and is embodied in the political culture of that country, and it's no use ignoring it, that every enlargement basically is a transfer of funds from rich, prosperous Netherlands to less rich and less prosperous and less successful Western Balkan countries, or Eastern European former relatively new member states, which is somehow bad, is somehow detrimental. And how can you establish yourself as a politician? Well, if you can say, well, we will bring accountability to this process and stop and revise the enlargement. Northern Macedonia, of all countries, suffered, I think, the worst as a result of such an attitude. To be fair, not from the Netherlands, but rather from France, when President Macron decided to, in 2019, to halt the enlargement process for basically purely domestic political reasons and for internal reasons of a need of a trade-off between France and Germany, because Germany, with all its mistakes, these things that I mentioned earlier with rule of law, these mostly come from German legal experts, mostly. This idea that the only way to establish accountability is by prosecuting people. But, Germany, for what it's worth, Germany wanted enlargement, whatever you say about how it wanted it and what it wanted. Whereas, in France and Netherlands, it was just, a currency that you can use. Now you see, for example, Austria, you see Italy being very much in favor of enlargement. You see Slovenia. Part of the reason is economic. Italy has very good trade relations and investment relations with all of the countries, Albania in particular, then Serbia. Honestly, with a better engagement, it could have done more also in Bosnia, I think, and in Macedonia, but their priorities are Albania and Serbia. Their banks are also present, so are the Slovenian banks, so are the Austrian banks. So you have, for example, from Austria, Slovenia, and Italy, you have this very favorable, very amicable stance towards enlargement. But it's based on economic interest, but it's also based about knowledge, because they possess, quite simply at the level of their ministries, at the level of the business community, they possess a greater knowledge of the region. But still, and then you have obviously Hungary, which is a country that truly is punching way above its weight and has its own, obviously, enlargement policy, where Hungary wants at the same time to say, well, we are your true friends because we are for enlargement, unlike the nasty Germans, which give you all this conditionality, unlike the nasty French, you can trust us. Hungary invests in Serbia and invests into the Serbian majority part of Bosnia. Even Hungarian academics, when you look at their backgrounds, when you look at what they write, they engage with the region, they travel to the region, they care. But they want to export also a very sort of populist, authoritarian, hybrid regime which is very undemocratic. Orban used to call it illiberal democracy. I'm not sure that the word democracy is appropriate for what they are trying to influence. And this whole influential thing, this whole idea of geopolitical influencing, unfortunately in the Balkans has escalated because and led to many short-sighted solutions because pretty much everybody somehow has a stake now in the Western Balkans. The US is there because the US is there as a security provider. As long as the Serbian majority part of Bosnia threatens secession, the Bosniak majority part of Bosnia will expect of the US to prevent secession, because they know very well, not just because from the war trauma of the 90s, that the European countries are slow to react and might not react at all. Whereas the US is seen as someone, not just through NATO, but through its own diplomatic channels, as someone who's willing to react. And people in Washington who are, let's say, a part of the defense community, people who care about NATO and its engagements, are well aware of that. However, the State Department and the part of the intelligence community obviously views this not so much as just as a chance to project its own influence, but rather to assert itself there in the absence of European influence. And therefore, many solutions that the US offers are not necessarily in line with the European enlargement project as such. Bosnia is the best example for this, and Kosovo is another example. I'll go to the Bosnian example now because it's easier, I think, to explain. Quite simply, in Bosnia, the EU wanted a closure of the so-called Office of the High Representative like 17 or 18 years ago now. That office is still operating, and Bosnia is, for what it's worth, a semi-protectorate. The US wanted it present because it saw as a tool of maintaining its own influence in the region. In Kosovo, it's true that the Americans have funded many very useful initiatives promoting democracy, promoting rule of law, promoting economic development. But in helping the EU facilitate the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina, the US, I would say they dragged its feet. I think they could have done much more on the side of, given the influence that they have, both in Serbia and in Kosovo, maybe not to achieve everything that was planned through this dialogue, but to make it more efficient, more speedy, more meaningful. The dialogue was tied to many solutions that were in turn tied to many questions of fundamental importance for the region, and Kosovo in particular. You know, Kosovo had a visa regime up until 1 or 2 years ago, and that's just terrible. And it had visa regime because the EU used it as a leverage in order to get some demands done. But you know that there's a perception that some US politicians said, or diplomats rather, said things like, well, maybe that's not your priority at this moment, which is not a message that you really want to send, especially when you know that people will be listening to you. Russia and China exploited all of these weaknesses. China, because there was quite simply an absence in financing, and the Chinese seemed to offer easy, almost unlimited access to financing. Montenegro learned pretty fast that this is not quite so, and that these the finances that you get from China might come with great difficulties, as their companies might not be able to perform every... Am I going overtime already? Oh my God. Yeah, so anyway, the Chinese exploited many of these opportunities in Bosnia, Montenegro, and Serbia in particular, because no funding for green transition was allocated, and it seemed like Chinese investments in highways and energy infrastructure would yield quick results. This hasn't really happened in Bosnia, but not just because we cut a bad deal with the Chinese, but rather due to very strong lobbying on behalf of the EU and the US for this not to happen. As a result, the green transition itself has been stalled and is actually advancing at a much, much slower pace I will remind you that when you look at the statistics of the top 10 polluted cities in Europe, cities in Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Northern Macedonia usually top the statistics. And that's due to the pollution, that's due to the fact that they're built in valleys where you have coal deposits and thermal power plants, which create horrible, horrible pollution. And the Russians themselves projected basically they were never an important economic actor. Some of the oligarchs that tried to do stuff like Deripaska in Montenegro and some people in the Serbian majority party of Republika Srpska didn't really achieve much there, long story short, but they are very good in projecting soft power and very good in trying to use Serbia as its proxy. And then Serbia, given all this fragmentation from Europe, quite simply realized at a certain point that it's much better or easier for it to play all of these cards at the same time and to offer itself to occasionally to Russia and to Ukraine and to the US and Hungarians and the EU and everybody, because it's the biggest country in the region, it's the most powerful economy. That's where a lot of residual from the earlier Yugoslav states remained, creating a diplomatic and political community that's able to sustain such rather complex movements for a country of that size and level of poverty. And as a result, you get this impression that the Russians might come any day, that the Russians might land an airborne division in Serbia and go and invade Bosnia. This is not realistic, but we know in politics that perceptions are what matters. And then some people, instead of anchoring Serbia strongly to the EU and NATO, trying to foster democratic changes in that country, rather try to manage this crisis endlessly instead of solving it. And that's, I think, the key takeaway from this is these projects that are now trying to stop this crisis management and trying to offer some resolutions. One is a staged accession process in which all the benchmarking and monitoring for the rule of law criteria would be strictly tied to the level of funding and access to structural and cohesion funds. This is a good idea if you're a great fan of Microsoft Excel spreadsheets and if you're a great fan of monitoring and if you like evaluation, because it allows you to on paper at least, tie every progress to every single euro spent. But it's not realistic because this is not pocket money that you're giving to people. We're talking about infrastructural projects worth billions of euros. So it's a good idea and it has use, but it cannot resolve, despite the local ownership it has, because it was developed by European experts and local think tanks, it cannot really work. An EEA-like deal, and whenever I say that something is EEA-like in Norway, people say, no, this is Norway, you cannot compare the deal that we have through the EEA, and nobody's comparing it. But the idea is really to have some sort of a arrangement in which total access and integration into the European market would happen as a replacement for enlargement. Because enlargement is not possible, because none of these issues will be resolved. That addresses part of the problems that we mentioned with economic development. And another idea which came allegedly from von der Leyen cabinet is the idea of the growth plan. The growth plan, operated by something called, I think, Reform and Growth Facility, is the idea of granting 6 billion euros to the 6 Balkan states, not unconditionally, but based on some economic reform programs called reform agendas. These agendas have been developed by the governments themselves in cooperation with the EU this year, which tells you that they already had these plans. They didn't write them from scratch. This is basically, it's strange to say, but these are sort of leftovers from many projects and reform initiatives that didn't materialize in the last 19 years, which explains how the government managed to produce it by itself without much consultancy. They just came up with them, each one of these governments. These documents exist. Not all of them are publicly available, but they do exist. And the idea is then that these countries will reform their economy and get this money for certain important projects. Now, this is basically, most of this funding is not new because it's part of the existing instrument for the pre-accession assistance. The amount of funding, that's the key takeaway, is insufficient. Insufficient for one country in the region. You cannot have a transformative effect that you desire with 6 billion euros spread over 6 countries. It's a sign of goodwill. But if you, I mean, it won't make Chinese investments look any less attractive. And in fact, some countries, and people have argued that Serbia has done this, we have not seen it yet. Some countries might just say, well, 6 billion euro, I mean, we can mobilize this. If we really wanted to, we can mobilize this from China. We can mobilize it from the United Arab Emirates. And because they can repay the debts, that's the point. None of the Western Balkan countries is doing well economically, but in no country you have very high debts. So that gives them potential to borrow money. You would think someone in the European Union would exploit this, but no. Now, another overarching idea that sort of speaks to one of the sins I mentioned is the Franco-German initiative. Why? Because Franco-German initiative to reform the EU could resolve the problem with qualified majority voting and could lead to the elimination of a need for consensus in European decision-making in all issues. What would that mean for the Western Balkans? Well, it would mean that, for example, Croatia would not be able to block and veto Serbia and Bosnia over some minor, unimportant issues should the countries be in the phase to actually join the Union. It would mean that Bulgaria could stop vetoing Northern Macedonia. So it could mean that some of the bilateral disputes which exist as a result of this nationalization of European enlargement would be resolved. As you have seen, basically, we need all four of these things to work and to happen at the same time, and we still don't know if we would get enlargement. So, uncertainty, that's the bonus. I wrote uncertainty, thinking of infinity perhaps. But that's where we don't really know where we're going, but we know where we've been. So I'm free and open for your questions, and I apologize for stepping over the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do you take this up? This was a very interesting presentation. You were a bit long, but it was so interesting to listen to you.
I'm sorry,
so I didn't. No, that was perfect. It was very, very good. I have a few questions. We can start. We will just take the chairs and sit here. Can just move it a bit closer. I have a few questions because I think it was very interesting, everything that you said. And when you come to the solutions, one thing that I was thinking about is that, of course, these are the solutions that are now kind of discussed and on the table, where to go forward from now with the enlargement. But at the same time, what you pointed to earlier was the challenges. And the challenges is really about the union's methodology to some point. That they are actually, when you kind of, it's interesting that the reports are not done in a comparative manner, so that you actually can see that one challenge in one country that is not really is not really looked at is the same problem in the other countries and how to deal with this. So that is one thing, that there is a challenge with the methodology, and these solutions will not kind of solve that problem. So you need to do something with the kind of the reporting system, the progress reporting, but also the programs and the different initiatives that the EU is funding in this region in order to solve, to make these countries comply with the Copenhagen criteria, and also especially when it comes to democracy, because there is. So how can this be done? Because that is the kind of the main challenge. Even if you choose the stage accession or the other things, EA agreement. EA agreement is actually if you are complying to have an EA agreement, then you comply to have a membership. You then qualify more or less for membership. So that is kind of why then not be full members if the union is open for that. So this is, I just wonder how can really the EU kind of changes its approach to help these countries or assist in a better way to comply with the criteria, because I think that's the kind of the key issues.
So I think in the short run, they should really focus on democracy and economy. And for the rule of law, they should, instead of endless institutional reforms, I think they should just say what do they expect. Since they pursued this whole idea of measurement so vigorously, then they should say, okay, we expect 4 corrupt politicians this year from Albania, we expect 16 from Kosovo, and we expect 9 from Serbia. And then just, that does sound a bit ridiculous, but at least it's precise and gives you an idea. But the real effort and the real push should be made to defend and establish democratic governance. They should engage with electoral systems in Bosnia and Serbia. They should make sure that, or try to work with the government in Northern Macedonia to make sure that it does not undo many of the good stuff that the previous government has done and for which it hasn't been rewarded by the EU, because much of the compliance work that has been done in Macedonia is honestly much better than in some other countries in the region. So obviously it should focus on it should basically insist on all these 4 issues that it started working on. So the Franco-German plan, the growth plan, the EEA deal, EEA-like deal, and the staged accession. These are all ideas of which we don't fully know whether they will work, and they must start working on them vigorously. And we expect that of the new, so the best thing would really be for the new commission to start engaging in these areas as soon as possible and learn by its mistakes. That would also mean that they would quite simply need to increase the staff and the staff membership in the commission dealing with these issues, because the capacities that they have now and the level of analysis that I presented and that some other people in the think tanks working on these matters present are quite simply overwhelm the people who work on these issues, and then there's a loss of institutional memory and they cannot perform. Finally, I think they should really try to eradicate some undemocratic and unuseful practices that they highlight in their reports. The denial of war crimes being committed, the importance of war crimes still brings a lot of trauma to minority communities, and for example, to Serbs in Kosovo, or to Bosniaks in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There is a constant need to downplay the significance of what happens in the 90s, and then this, in turn, creates a constant narrative where people constantly talk about war and talk about the 90s. This is specifically a Bosnian problem more than anywhere else. But it creates a really toxic climate in which war outbreak is not likely, but quite simply there is great disillusionment with the union and its processes, because they don't seem to bring a transformative change, because they lack the funds and they lack predictable political outcomes. In the short run, I don't think that any of these foreign actors, meaning non-EU actors, can increase much their presence in the region. China economically, but even that would be limited to 1 or 2 jurisdictions. But you know, so you could say the enlargement is the main game in town in all of these countries, but that will not maybe be so forever. And the purpose of enlargement is definitely not to endlessly keep countries in the limbo. And then also, I will end with this, nothing changes, people say preparation changes countries. Well, I mean, not really. Membership and access, when the political class accesses the European institution, that really changes countries. And that creates a significant change. There is a worry, of course, that, you know, if you accept the countries from the region, that in 5 or 10 years you will have, that one of them will become the next Hungary and start imposing crazy projects on everybody. But if the Franco-German plan goes along, and if some other things happen, and if they innovate into some other form of membership, then maybe that would not happen. It could
I think
alleviate it, you could lower
that
the
is the
risk.
fear in the EU, that you need to do all these steps before having enlarging the EU, because you can risk having that challenge.
True, but they underestimated the importance. I mean, that's, I don't mean to be nationalistic or anything, but that is German legal thinking. They believe that, the legal sphere in which rule of law appears, that this is somehow a separate, dimension of existence. And that in that sphere, time does not exist. Things might happen in a year, they might happen in 150 years, but they must happen. They don't realize that you cannot wait for economic development forever, that people move, that judges and prosecutors, when they make decisions, no matter how institutionally independent they are, judges and prosecutors always look, and that's proven in legal and political theory, to whether the country has free and fair elections, whether the party that's in power is removable, or whether you are living in a de facto one-party state. And that is something that this insistence, because their idea was, we don't want another Bulgaria and Romania, let's get the rule of law act before joining the EU. And now we know actually that the rule of law always backslide, that you have to fight for it. And one of the reasons why perceptions of corruption are so low here and rule of law is so strong is this level of social capital that you have in Scandinavian countries and the high level of trust in institutions. And in order to build this, you would need a more trustful process to begin with, but also you need some economic development, you need some predictability. You want to know that if you're mistreated in a poorly paid job, that you can switch jobs. And you can switch jobs if there's a vibrant job market, and there's a vibrant job market if there are investments, if there's development, if there's economic growth. But for the EU, the logic was always only the rule of law provides economic growth. But we know actually from instances and that was the part of the sort of neoliberal agenda of the early 21st century, but we know from political and legal theory, we know that economic growth also happens in corrupt settings, which is not to say that I advocate for corruption, which is just to say that using the rule of law as the only variable is for measuring any country is very risky.
But you said also that the EU had this sloppy reporting. So there is something also with the EU policies, programming, a project that they are funding. So one thing is that maybe you need to speed up the enlargement process, maybe letting countries in before they have the perfect system, because the perfect system probably doesn't exist. No. And even the countries in the EU do not have perfect systems. But you need some kind of level of, for instance, the electoral kind of laws, the electoral systems need to work in a certain way. And you mentioned that example of was it Bosnia? Yeah. Where they could have gone more into this. So before you come to that point, is of enlargement, is there, because this is interesting, how has the EU not been kind of had enough bottom-up approach, not enough knowledge about the countries and how they work differently, because there has been very much a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to ticking boxes to kind of
well, yeah.
Is that one of the problems that they haven't?
I would say that the EU does not fully govern its own projects, and that's because quite simply the project management is so you would expect that there are local delegations or embassies, they would be in each of these countries, that they have a full overview of what each project is achieving, that the EU is funding in the country, whether they fund a local NGO, whether they fund the government, whether they pay external EU consultants to do so. You would expect, full overview. And that's not really the case. It's highly decentralized. And it's a part of the sort of, wider problem where, and I think Mariana Mazzucato writes about this, where the governments generally govern less and outsource more. And they've outsourced some parts of these projects which had transformative nature to companies which care more about profit than about societal change. And I don't think it's realistic to change that. I think what should be demanded of them is more accountability. And then, quite simply, the EU must work on its own capacities in all of these delegations and in Brussels to better oversee the process and to try to sort of tighten the screws to get most out of it, most quality for transformation and for the citizens and more value for the money it's committing.
Marianne, you have a question.
Thank you, Marianne Ridvan. I'm here at NUPI. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm also part of the Re-engage project that Pernille referred to earlier. So I have lots of questions, but I'll try to be be brief. It was super interesting, and you, of course, focused a lot on the causes for the EU's failed enlargement process, but simplified in a sense. So I have a few questions. I was wondering, it seems almost irrational to have such a bad policy for so many years. So I was wondering, why is the EU failing so badly? Why does it keep having these policies when it obviously doesn't work? And, or to put it, or maybe frame it differently, why has it worked with Croatia and not the others? So has the EU kind of conducted the same policy in all of these different countries, or did it do something different with Croatia? And if so, what was different? Because you seem to put all the countries in the same category. Second, I was also wondering if you presented like, so the EU's policy play into the hands of Russia and China in a sense. So I was wondering, is it also something that Russia and China do to undermine the EU's policies, so that there's also a correlation the other way? And just really, really briefly, trust and social cohesion, which you mentioned, is also something that we want to study in the Re-engage project. And I was wondering, is there something the EU can do on the ground to kind of promote trust and social cohesion in these countries to build a stronger democracy? Thanks.
So part of the blame really lies also with the civil society in the Balkans. We were pretty much everybody in the civil society in the Balkans, I mean the progressive people, were in favor of the EU integration and still are and remain to this day. However, we often, and I was a part of that world, and I can say that we often didn't criticize the EU as much as we should have. We were too conformistic. We were afraid for our own funding. We were thinking that there is a big higher brain somewhere that knows all of this and that things would have been different, will become different. And they became different, they became worse. So part of the issue is really, I have to say there with us. When local politicians criticize the EU, they never did so on principle grounds. They never tried to make this sort of theory of change, this sort of holistic speech. I'm not under the illusion that the speech or the lecture that I delivered here was perfect. There were probably many mistakes in it, but at least I tried to cover as much ground as possible, give different angles, tell bizarre anecdotes, whereas people generally do not engage in this. When you speak like this, the way I'm speaking, usually you are on a I wouldn't say on a payroll, but usually you are an exponent of either a Russian influence or of a strange American think tank. You are not someone who is pro-EU, because pro-EU narrative is often dry, boring. Think also about the EU more generally. Do you know of a good movie about the EU? Do you know of a good TV series? You have several episodes of Borgen set in the you don't have that. They don't know how to promote themselves. They dry, boring, horribly boring, mind-numbingly boring. And it's sad that it's like that. It's a wonderful, important peace-building project that is unable to have a good TV show about itself. So Croatia was different because Croatia had Germany as a strategic ally, and we should not forget that. And Germany tried to establish the same level of strategic partnership with Serbia. And it was on a good way to do so, and it believed it had done so. That partnership fell apart sometimes 5 or 6 years ago, they believed that they would be on course. They genuinely wanted this integration to happen. They wanted influence. In Croatia, they were much less, I would say, strict regarding dealing with the past, regarding the legacy of the war. You know, in some areas of Croatia, ethnic cleansing happened. That wasn't addressed in a proper way. The pressure from that's not EU related, but it sort of helped. The pressure from the ICTY, the tribunal that was to prosecute those responsible for war crimes committed in the 90s, which was much lower to Croatia than to Serbia, Bosnia, and even to Kosovo when you think about it. So as a result, Croatia was quite simply to do less. Croatia was judged strictly on prosecuting corruption. And many people were, and to this day, they have a decent track record of corruption prosecution in Croatia. But in many of these other areas, I wouldn't say that the policies were as strict as towards the other Western Balkans countries. So that was one difference. And also in Croatia, there was let's say the Croatian political class never seriously doubted joining the EU, whereas some other political classes still doubt this despite the citizens being in favor. Regarding Russia and China, China initially didn't undermine and didn't want to undermine the EU membership, because if you think about, you know, the days when they launched the Belt and Road Initiative, they wanted actually to do important things in Italy also. So for them, they did some important things in Greece. So they wanted the accession to succeed. Nowadays, though, I'm not sure. From a purely sort of realist perspective, I'm not so sure that they are so much in favor. They can work with it, but they don't care. Russia also didn't used to oppose the membership up until, I guess, the last 7 or 8 years, when they really became anti-EU membership, and when we know that they fund media who spread these quite simply lies about what EU membership brings. They talk about it as a cultural project which is to rob the countries of their traditions, and they use fear, often borrowed also from Hungarian sources, to spread, especially in the Serbian majority part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, fears that, you know, there will be no parents, no mother and father, but parent number 1 and parent number 2. And when you hear some politicians saying these things, to sow distrust in the EU, they say it in such, I used a direct quote, precisely because they want to show to their Russian mentors that they are using these parroted lines, no matter how stupid they sound. So yeah, I would say that Russia, while economically it cannot really achieve, especially after these sanctions, it's not really realistic to do the investments in any event. I would say they are still pretty strong in disinformation campaigns. And I would say that they have built, in that sense, a strong base in many online communities, most of them based in Serbia, but with strong regional viewership.
Before I give the floor to you, Rieker, I just wanted, is there anything that the EU is doing to try to kind of counter that misinformation? You said that the EU is boring, and maybe it's too technocratic, maybe it's too kind of legally oriented, but they should also have kind of, do they promote a narrative, a counter-narrative?
They fund fact-checking mechanisms. There is a French TV show called Parlement, the Parliament, and it happens in the European Parliament. And it's the only EU-based TV show. It's cheap. Not too many people watch it. Why don't they just buy the rights and screen it across the region? I mean, it's not great, but still it's better, I think, than trying to counter narratives by funding fact-checking, by funding investigative journalism. of that is important because you need to do that, because these people who spread this information are getting better and better in what they do. It's no longer 2016 or 17 with the strange troll farms. It's very sophisticated. These people have podcasts with intelligent, educated people who believe in what they're doing and are able to to fool you because they never lie outright. They use pieces of information that are verifiable and quite simply twisting them, but with the ultimate goal of subverting these processes. The ultimate goal is not really, you know, for Serbia or any other country in the Balkans to become a gubernia, to become a part of Russia. That's not the ultimate project. I mean, the project is really to subvert the process of European integration.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting, and I share much of your assessment when it comes to the external actors. I have a comment and a question. So my comment first. When it comes to the division of work between external and internal actors, for instance, within the rule of law sector. So in my thinking, you know, while external actors can do a lot of the technical stuff, and you mentioned some of it, they can rebuild a new court building, they can offer advanced training, etc. I think that the more democratic and needed and sustainable changes must come from within, from below, from the politicians, from civil society, etc. I don't think necessarily that you disagree about that, but I did my PhD on looking at international police reform, and I looked at Bosnia and Kosovo and Serbia, but also Afghanistan and South Sudan, and I saw that, I mean, it is possible to achieve things when you divide between the more technical issues and the more democratic issues. But I think we cannot expect actors such as the EU to be able to promote reforms within the more democratic part of these sectors. So that's just an assessment of this. But my question is, and maybe you disagree, so please comment on that, but my question is whether you can explore a bit further the current situation and main tensions when it comes to cooperation or lack thereof between Republika Srpska and the Federation, and also perhaps between the three constituent people of Bosnia. Thank you.
Yeah, so the perception is that they don't cooperate at all. And the perception is that of a permanent veto process, primarily led by Republika Srpska. That perception largely conforms to the reality. What it ignores, though, is this whole problem where, again, the civil society and the researchers sort of let us down in assessing truly to what extent is Bosnia integrated. And when I say integrated, I mean to what extent does it function as an economic, political, and social space? And how can you think about it as a one social space? The Republika Srpska government has done a good job in creating the perceptions I mentioned and in assessing its own, I wouldn't say sovereignty, but assessing, establishing itself as if it's on a path to independence, which is right next door, which is just about to happen, which is just like, it will happen tomorrow. Maybe there will be a referendum, maybe not. Maybe we will just declare independence. Maybe, and that has been going on for some time, for 17 years now, you know, and for an independence movement, they have very little to show for. What they have achieved from 2007 to 2016. They have achieved that, first of all, the push that there was for more efficient central government from external actors ended. They have achieved significant concessions in lowering the capacities and capabilities of the Bosnian national level office of the prosecutor to go after people in Republika Srpska. They never cared about the people prosecuted for war crimes. rhetorically, they would say a thing or two about them, but in how only Serbs get adjudicated or prosecuted. But in reality, they didn't care. In reality, they wanted a prosecutorial office that would not go into high-level cases of corruption. And for Republika Srpska, you could say that they have achieved this. The level of corruption there has grown, and in the entire Bosnia has grown in the last 10 or 12 years. Only in the last 2 or 3 years in federation you see a certain efforts to really try to lower this. On the other hand, they have also achieved, and this should be recognized, they have achieved that they are somehow important on the international plane, that you have wide variety of actors. You have Slovak politicians caring about Republika Srpska, Hungarian politicians, Israeli business persons, Russia, medals, icons being stolen from Ukraine, being gifted. Stuff out of the cheap spy novels happens when you look at relationship of Republika Srpska with the world, lobbying huge amounts of money, despite the leading people of Republika Srpska being sanctioned. It's not illegal for them to lobby in the United States for the removal of those very sanctions. And so that tells you that they have achieved something, and they have become a player, again, pushing much against their weight. But, if you think about it in a more sort of security sense, what do they create? They create a demand for security. They create, especially among the Bosniak population, this feeling of ontological insecurity. These people are, the Bosniaks in Bosnia, are reliving the trauma of genocide. And that's not a very healthy place to be in, and could potentially lead to a conflict. But it also creates a need for security providers. So paradoxically, the stronger the rhetoric in Republika Srpska, the more demand for American influence, the more demand for NATO membership, and then this demand doesn't come. So it's a strange vicious circle where you begin really to wonder, to whom does this rhetoric serve? To independence of Republika Srpska, it certainly does not serve. Because in 2016, they really made a credible threat of doing a referendum, which they didn't do. In 2021, early 2022, it seemed that there was some sort of a security event which has happened. That's my theory, at least, because I know that some people in Sarajevo suddenly decided, of various nationalities, suddenly decided to relocate themselves for 2 or 3 weeks to Croatia because they feared some sort of a conflict. This was just before the aggression against Ukraine started. There was we don't still know publicly what happened, but we know that there was truly a fear then of a war happening. But think about it. 2 years have passed since that time, and in the meantime, you haven't really, only more attention from the Western actors has been paid to the events in Bosnia. How can a war now, or some credible threat of a Russian proxy who commands a territory that doesn't even have 1 million people, how can it be really realistic of them seceding unless either the US or the EU supports them? That would be the only way, really, of them doing so. So, which tells you really that they're not using their leverage to remove Milorad Dodik from power. Also, all of this paradox, and this is where it gets, I'm sorry to use that word, perverted, all of this does not mean that there is no collaboration between the two entities and economic integration. There was a story a few days ago of one of the leading business persons in Republika Srpska publicly announcing, we don't know for what purposes, that he borrowed money from the leading Bosniak businessman, that he's like my brother. I really needed to borrow. I will repay him back. Why this announcement? You could have just borrowed money and say nothing. So obviously there is a need sometimes for this de-escalating rhetoric, So it's sometimes you get the impression that you're living in a sort of strange discourse exercise rather than in a real, post-war conflict zone where the war might erupt the next minute. And that's what the reason why I'm answering this so in such a convoluted way is not to confuse you. It's rather that you see all these aspects to the problem, and the conclusions you will draw maybe more clear than I have.
Thank you very much. I'm the Latvian ambassador to Norway. So my country joined the EU 20 years ago, and I wanted to a little bit sometimes to maybe contradict the statements that be made that the enlargement policy has been maybe bad or unsuccessful. I would say that has been very good EU policy, very successful. After my country, others have joined, and I think without this enlargement policy, there would be still very different situation in northern eastern part in the Baltics and in Central Europe and also in the Western Balkans. It could be much worse, and I think it's actually the success of its own kind of the victim of its own success that so many countries still want to join, and it's not only Western Balkans, it's Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine. So I think it's actually not to always label everything very negatively. I think, of course, it's not a perfect process. EU is also very different and complicated animal. It's if we have issues in one country, either Norway or in Latvia, dealing something, remember EU is 27 countries, so the processes are very complicated, and I've worked with the EU a lot. Maybe not to go too much in a kind of commenting, because it's a very interesting topic, and I worked with the EU and enlargement back home as well. One question is that when I have previously seen that EU has never been made as an institution to check the rule of law or democracy standards, so it has never been the case. So I remember I wrote one paper in my university studies 20 years ago, and the main conclusion was actually that the EU is relying on the data from the Council of Europe, the organization in Strasbourg. And actually I wanted to ask you, how would you say, or is the relation or the criteria is followed on the rule of law and democracy? Because in the Council of Europe you have the standards, you have the Venice Commission, you have the court you mentioned, the Human Rights Court, and you have expert institutions that can actually evaluate rule of law. You didn't have this expertise. Now they are kind of building, because of developments inside the UN generally. That would be my first question. And the second quickly is, I think there has been for a long time perception that EU membership as such would bring kind of this pull factor of the political elites and also the societies, that would this possibility to join EU would be enough to mobilize the countries, to mobilize the support, and things would happen, and the countries would reform and people would support it. How would you describe the situation now in the Western Balkans? Is there enough kind of support to the EU that it's kind of, it is still attractive, EU membership is still attractive, where to go? Or as you mentioned, maybe these alternatives that maybe, you know, China, Russia or something is still attracting politicians, political elites, or even societies. How would you comment on that? Thanks.
Thank you. So we know that actually, if you would, because a recent poll was published recently by the International Republican Institute, showing an overwhelming degree of support in all the states, with somewhat lower percentages in Serbia. However, don't forget, whenever referendums were held in any state that was to join the EU, there was a strong campaign by the government, which is to sort of for the EU, and usually they worked. And sometimes these lower levels of support, whenever it's below 70%, gets sort of overplayed, I would say. Especially if it happens in Serbia. It gets overplayed as if you see there is no support anyway. I don't buy that. I think that if the current government in Serbia if we would have an announcement that there's a referendum in 3 months, I think that the current government would easily won that referendum if it would have campaigned in favor. So I wouldn't, and in other 5 countries, there's no doubt at all about the degree of support for the Union. Regarding this other question, thank you for mentioning this. I tend to forget the role that the Venice Commission plays, and it's true. But you know, you cannot really overuse the Venice Commission. For example, what they never used, and I never understood why, it's a small institution based in Warsaw in Poland, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And I mean, these people would conduct, you know, in-depth assessments of electoral and legislative systems in countries. But this was only in the last 2 or 3 years that they use this as a resource. It's very strange. But like 10 years ago, it was not a thing to rely much on their assessments. It's much better now. It's much better now, and I hope that this capacity building continues.
Thank you so much. I wanted to end because of course I very much agree with you that the enlargement has been very successful. I think the idea of the project is very much that because it has been successful in the past, it's very important that it continues to be successful. And as we have seen that for some years now, it has been kind of a stalemate in that process, and now it has kind of regained the new momentum. And how can we learn from, so that's the idea of the project, is very much how can we learn from the things that has been done, especially in the Western Balkans when this enlargement process have been going on for so long, and have not, I mean, in case of your country, it was a bit of a more speedy process, one could say. So this, I think, now is how can we learn from the past, but also, and this is also something that the EU is very much concerned with, and this is why they fund this project, and also 300 other projects that is going on at the same time. How can we learn from the past? How can we how to adjust this policy? So the idea of the project, when we end in 2.5 years, is to come up with some advice on what can be done better. So we will do field work in 6 countries, 3 countries in the Western Balkans, and also 3 countries in Eastern Europe, surveys, and try to figure out how does this really, these processes, these different programs that the EU has funded, how does it really work? What has it resulted in? How can they be adjusted? So I very much, but it was good that because it's easy to focus on all the negative parts, and of course the enlargement is a very important process. I think we all agree on that. It's just how to make it a continued successful project and a security policy instrument that it is, especially now in a period with geopolitical tensions. We have 30 seconds, so 1 minute. I just wanted to end on, of course, we're talking about enlargement. In Norway is very positive towards enlargement, kind of helping countries to become members of the EU, while Norway is staying on the outside. And that is a paradox in itself, but it's interesting. And then if you could give one advice to the Norwegian government, what can the Norwegian government do in assisting the EU in this process, or assisting the countries, something that the EU cannot do?
Yeah, well, 3 things. Continue to support gender equality through the projects as you have done so far. People don't give you much credit for this, but it's important. These associations work slowly, they work for a change. It's a long process. You see it when you look at it as a sort of, only if you look at the 15-year scale. Consider, second advice, investing or reinvesting into the green transition in the Western Balkans. It will pay off. And thirdly, yeah, actually these 2 things are important. I think these 2 things are really, really important. Thirdly, you do have a certain expertise that has been used with regards to NATO integrations. I think maybe continuing that work or expanding it should also be useful.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nedim, for a very interesting presentation, talk, and discussion. And thank